Je m'appelle Alice Weinberg, je fais partie de l'ILOB et il me fait grand plaisir aujourd'hui de vous accueillir au nom de l'ILOB et du CERBAL, le Centre canadien d'études et de recherche en bilinguisme et aménagement linguistique, au premier forum de 2017. On a eu des événements l'automne dernier, là c'est le premier de cette nouvelle année. The aim of the OLBI Research Forum is to provide a platform for researchers both inside at the ILOB and outside the ILOB to exchange with different professors, researchers, students, political deciders, and everybody who is interested in language and research, and in the domain of second language teaching and language policy and language acquisitions. Our forums are open to all, but we usually like to find out beforehand if you can register. That's something which is very appreciated. If nothing else, to get the coffee and to have enough coffee to welcome you in cold days like today. Presentations are also broadcasted online, and if you cannot come and join you in person, you're welcome to join you virtually and participate in the discussion which will take place afterwards. Today, Nikolay is going to talk on reflection on childhood bilingualism and multilingualism. That's the first talk of the series of for this year. The next event is going to take place on March 3rd, and put it in your calendar. You're going to have a treat. We have Professor Stuart Webb from the University of Western Ontario, who will be speaking with us on vocabulary acquisition. And we have some specialists here at the ILOB also on vocabulary acquisition. So most certainly it's going to be a lively presentation and discussion. Le 11 et 12 mai de cette année, le groupe de recherche en immersion universitaire, qui fait partie du CERBAL, va organiser un symposium de 2 jours sur l'immersion au niveau universitaire. Le programme provisoire est en ligne et puis nous vous encourageons vivement à venir à cet événement qui va être marquant pour cette année. Mais maintenant, j'aimerais revenir sur la présentation d'aujourd'hui et sur notre conférencier. Nous avons ici notre collègue Nikolay Slavkov, qui est professeur adjoint à l'ILOB et depuis 2013. He has previously taught in Canada, in the United States, in China and Bulgaria. Ses intérêts de recherche se situent principalement dans le domaine du bilinguisme et du multilinguisme et de l'enseignement des langues chez les enfants et les adultes, les technologies, ainsi que la transmission et le maintien des langues minoritaires. He has also interest in linguistic theory, particularly Slavic linguistics. His work has appeared in many prestigious journals like the International Journal of Multilingualism, the International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism, Second Language Research, the Canadian Journal of Applied Linguistics, TESOL Canada, Lingua, and the Journal of Slavic Linguistics. So, là maintenant, je vais laisser la parole à Nikolay qui va parler pendant à peu près 1 heure et sa présentation sera suivie d'une période de questions. Et si vous n'avez pas signé la feuille de présence, je vais vous la faire recirculer. À toi la parole, Nikolay.
Okay, merci beaucoup, Alice. Merci pour cette introduction. Donc, merci pour cette introduction, Alice. Merci à l'ILOB, merci au CERBAL pour l'invitation. Je suis vraiment ravi de partager avec vous quelques aspects de mes intérêts de recherche. Donc, comme Alice a déjà dit, j'ai essayé de regrouper mes intérêts de recherche dans 3 domaines. Dont l'acquisition de langues secondes chez les adultes, la pédagogie et la technologie, la linguistique théorique, spécifiquement la linguistique slave, Et puis, finalement, la politique familiale, politique linguistique familiale, le bilinguisme, le multilinguisme à l'enfance, la transmission des langues minoritaires et le maintien des langues minoritaires, et aussi le choix de la langue de scolarisation. On va se concentrer aujourd'hui sur ce troisième domaine et je vais partager avec vous des aperçus de trois projets. Une étude de cas avec une petite fille bilingue, une étude plus grande à méthodologie mixte et finalement, if you still have patience, une analyse de profilage linguistique fait par les formulaires d'inscription aux écoles élémentaires publiques. Donc, je vais commencer par vous donner un peu de contexte. La politique linguistique familiale, c'est un domaine émergent qui combine des aperçus de l'acquisition de langues chez les enfants et aussi la politique linguistique. Les buts sont de découvrir, de décrire, de peaufiner vraiment des pratiques ou des règles familiales explicites et implicites à propos de l'utilisation des langues dans la famille. On sait que la PLF est basée sur la socialisation linguistique et on sait aussi que la famille est l'unité primordiale pour la socialisation linguistique, mais il y a aussi, bien sûr, avec l'âge, des autres aspects comme des amis, l'école, etc. So, in family language policy, really the questions that researchers often ask are who speaks what language to whom within the household, and how can we get children to keep using a minority language in the household. Of course, issues such as language dominance, shifts between active and passive bilingualism, incomplete acquisition, language attrition, language shift, and language loss are part of family language policy. Another aspect of family language policy are these strategies or models of family language input or family language use, such as the one person, one language model, the model where each parent speaks in a different language to their child or children. Also, the minority language at home model where both parents would be speaking a minority language to the child. A mixed approach where the two parents will be alternating freely between the two languages. And the majority language at home approach, where the parents will be speaking a majority language at home, but the child may still acquire a minority language through school exposure or through child care providers, etc. So oftentimes within these models, the question arises as to what is the best model for family language use. And typically, it has been assumed that the one parent, one language model is oftentimes appropriate and really very good because it provides relatively equal input in the two languages and helps the child separate the languages from early on. But we'll see from the first study that I'll talk about that this isn't necessarily always the case. Donc on commence avec le premier projet. C'est une étude de cas avec une jeune fille bilingue. La participante s'appelle Sophie. It's of course a pseudonym. Elle est née au Canada. La mère était anglophone et le père était bulgare. Elle était exposée à deux langues de la naissance. Donc, il s'agit de Bilingual First Language Acquisition, ou BFLA. Et la famille a utilisé le modèle un parent, une langue. Les données sont collectées par un journal de bord du père et aussi des enregistrements de discours spontanés. In the initial language development of this child from birth to 1 year and 7 months was harmonious and balanced as per the journal entries. Now, what do I mean by harmonious and balanced bilingualism? This child hit the typical developmental milestones for monolingual development at the same time with the two languages. So about age 10 months, the first words appeared in both languages. And here I have examples of how later on, about age 1 year and 4 months, 2-word utterances appeared in both languages. And then soon after that, at 1 year and 5 months, 1 year and 6 months, we have examples of multi-word utterances in both languages. Another example of the harmonious and balanced bilingual development are these metalinguistic, is the metalinguistic awareness of this child who, from very early on, you see here at age 1 year and 5 months, was already aware of the 2 languages to the level that she would just sit and spontaneously recite translation equivalents in the 2 languages on her own as a game without the parents being inside the room. Occasionally she will be caught doing that. So she would sit there and recite words like dinya, watermelon, bubbles, piano, cassia, apricot, chicken, pile, and so on. So quite happy developing bilingually as a balanced bilingual at that point. However, very early on, at 1 year and 7 months, social interactions with other children who spoke English increased. Of course, that's part of a normal socialization. An English-speaking daycare was introduced at a part-time basis. And at that point, a decrease in production in Bulgarian was observed. And of course, an increase in production in English. And soon after that, the child essentially stopped speaking Bulgarian. She started responding exclusively in English to the Bulgarian-speaking parent, except for 2 words, monosyllabic da, yes, and ne, no. So essentially, she became a passive bilingual. She stopped producing Bulgarian. And it's interesting to notice here in terms of socialization, even though she's supposed to be socialized by the one parent, one language model, as a child who responds only in Bulgarian to the one parent and only in English to the other parent, she, at this very early age, around 2 years of age, she was able to renegotiate her own socialization into getting the parents to still speak to her in the 2 languages, but she would not respond in the minority language. So at that point, there was an opportunity for an intervention on the part of the parents, who organized a 10-day trip to Bulgaria with the Bulgarian-speaking father. You probably guessed by now that that's me. And the English-speaking mother did not travel, importantly. And so the hypothesis was that some degree of Bulgarian reactivation was expected, but there was no really specific prediction as to how much and to what extent she could recover over a brief 10-day period of time. And here I should point out that the literature on language attrition is quite rich in terms of children becoming passive bilingual and children losing a minority language, but there is much less literature on the opposite phenomenon, the reactivation or recovery of a language that has become passive or undergone attrition. So this is where I see the contribution of this study. Donc, on a continué d'utiliser le journal du bord. Et maintenant aussi, on a commencé de faire des enregistrements. Donc, on a fait un enregistrement avant le voyage en Bulgarie et les autres ont fait pendant la visite en Bulgarie. Donc, on a créé un corpus d'environ 10 000 mots. And then that corpus was, of course, transcribed using the well-known chat format. And the data were analyzed using quantitative and qualitative analysis with the CLAN software, which is associated with the Child Language Data Exchange System, known as CHILDIS, and maintained by Brian McWhinney at Carnegie Mellon University. So in terms of results, I don't have, because I'm trying to talk about 3 projects here today, I don't have the time to show you different charts and tables with the results, but I have a short little summary about the results over the 10 days. So mean length of utterance, or MLU in words, was measured over the 10 days. And there was an increase in Bulgarian MLU and a decrease in English MLU over the course of the visit. Lexical diversity was also measured using 2 measures, TTR and D. And so those calculations also showed an increased lexical diversity in Bulgarian and a decreased lexical diversity in English. Syntactic complexity was examined qualitatively through the transcripts, and all of a sudden the syntactic complexity became similar in Bulgarian and English, considering that she wasn't even speaking Bulgarian before the visit anymore, right? So things that were tested in her Bulgarian transcripts were embedded infinitive clauses, if clauses, and relative clauses, which were grammatical structures that were never tested in her Bulgarian before. And mind you, this is still quite an early age, 2 years. And I want to share one piece of, one example actually from the data, the choice of language in story narration. So just a few days before the trip to Bulgaria, she had the opportunity to go and see the musical The Lion King. Of course, she saw it in English, and she was really impressed by it, a little bit scared, and she loved to tell the story of The Lion King or parts of the stories, and she would tell them always in English. Here is a very brief sample from the data on day 3 of the visit, where she was still English dominant and telling the story or parts of the story of The Lion King in English, mostly. I will play it for you just so you get a sense of, if I can hit it with the mouse.
We was watching big and move faster. He talks words and words, and I don't like. I like to go away, and the audience, and there's Dada go away, and Nana go away, and Simba go away. They talk a big word, and Kimmel faster. Talk a big word.
Very dramatic intonation, but so the point here is that she's in the 3rd day of the visit to Bulgaria and still English dominant, as you see. What happens a few days later, day 8 of the visit? You can see from the transcript that now it's mostly Bulgarian, and I'll play it to you for you so that. So this is very exciting development, considering that she only said yes and no 9 days before this happened, right? And it's an illustration of this amazing switch that happens under the right conditions. And just to give you a further representation of that switch, here is the percentage of utterances, monolingual utterances in English versus monolingual utterances in Bulgarian over the 10 days of the trip. You see day 0, the day before the trip, they're close, they're very low, and they should really be almost 0, but I don't have time to explain why they're a little bit higher, they're close to 18%. But ask me if you're curious about it. Ask me later on during the question session. But you see this trend of Bulgarian being close to 0 at the beginning, over the day over the course of the visit, going up and being close to 100% towards the end. In English, the reverse trend, right? Okay. Donc maintenant pour la discussion, le bilinguisme est un phénomène dynamique et fluide. On a vraiment vu la vulnérabilité et la fragilité des langues minoritaires. Mais on a aussi observé qu'une langue qui est devenue passive peut être réactivée avec succès dans une courte période de temps. On a vu que le modèle un parent, une langue n'est pas une garantie des résultats satisfaisants pour un bilinguisme actif. Et c'est important ça. On a vu la nécessité de stratégies supplémentaires pour s'assurer que l'enfant parle la langue minoritaire. And we see how a very short-term complete immersion in the target language seems to be more beneficial than the regular daily input over the course of these previous 2 years that the Bulgarian father was providing in a minority context. And so to finish with this project, I hope you've been enjoying skating on the Rideau Canal. The reason I am bringing this up is because I think there is a similarity between minority languages and the Rideau Canal Skateway. We really saw that minority languages exist only when the right conditions are present. We know that they need to be taken care of. They need to be properly maintained, otherwise they may crack or melt away. But on a positive note, they may come back if the right conditions become present again. And so really, in terms of family language policy, the message for parents is to not stop speaking the minority language, even if your child stops speaking and renegotiates socialization, right? This may seem like a trivial message, but it is very easy for a parent to give up once the child has become a passive bilingual. So really the message is don't give up and things may change again. Okay, so beyond the case study, I developed an interest in family language policy at a larger scale. So I was at that point more interested in what other families do. I was also interested not only in bilingualism, but also in multilingualism. So what happens when we add a third language or a fourth language? I was interested in age effects. So how do family language dynamics change when a child enters school age? Because up to this point, we were dealing with a child who was 2 years and 3 months. And also I was interested in choice of language of schooling, which as we know is a very powerful socialization factor that presents new pressures and new opportunities. Donc maintenant, on va commencer avec le deuxième projet. C'était une étude plus grande à méthodologie mixte. On a conçu un questionnaire. On a eu aussi des entrevues de suivi avec 20 familles, mais je ne veux pas discuter les résultats de l'interview maintenant. On a distribué le questionnaire parmi des familles de 170 bilingual or multilingual children who were at school age in Ontario. Ils étaient exposés à 2 langues au plus, so simultaneous or sequential bilinguals or multilinguals. Et le but était d'intégrer la politique linguistique familiale ainsi que le choix scolaire ou le choix de langue de scolarisation. So to give you an idea of what the questions were on the questionnaire, there were questions pertaining to the children, so language of current school program, attendance at a heritage school program, if applicable, native languages, languages currently understood, languages currently spoken, reading and writing abilities, if any, for each language listed, languages used to watch television or play video games, languages in which parents read books with or to the children, if applicable, and languages spoken by the children with their siblings. There were also questions pertaining to the parents, so native language or native languages of the parents, current languages spoken by the parents, languages that parents spoke between each other, so to communicate with each other, and languages spoken to the child by each parent. So a fairly detailed questionnaire. In fact, I know some of you here have filled it out, for which I thank you. And so to give you a general idea of the descriptive data, here are the different home language use models reported by the families. So 73 children were exposed to a mixed model where the parents freely alternated between 2 or more languages. 54 children were, exposed to a minority language at home model where the parents spoke only the minority language at home. 34 children were exposed to the one parent, one language model, and 9 children were exposed to a majority language at home model. In terms of the number of languages that the children had, 79 were bilingual, 83 were trilingual, 7 had 4 languages, and 1 had 5 languages. In terms of passive versus active bilingualism or multilingualism, so in other words, the number of languages understood versus the number of languages spoken, we see that 10% of the sample were passive bilinguals, and about 11% of the sample were passive multilinguals, and the rest were active bilinguals or multilinguals. And this reflects other studies in the literature that have reported similar rates of passive bilingualism and multilingualism. So again, I am not showing detailed charts and tables of the data, but this is a summary of some of the trends for the parents versus the children. So we see that the parents privilege the minority language in speaking to their children, in speaking with each other, and but not necessarily in reading books to their children. They mostly read books with their children or to their children in a majority language. And again, this is just a pattern. It's not an absolute piece of data, just a pattern for you to consider. And then we look at the children, however, and we see something different. We see that they privilege the majority language in speaking with their siblings, in playing video games, in watching TV, and in reading and writing activities. So in a way, we see this conflict or this tension, this pressure between the minority language privileged by the parents and the choice of the majority language among the children. So in addition to the descriptive data, I also ran a logistic regression with regards to bilingual versus multilingual outcomes. And so there were significant associations for 5 factors. So children were more likely to be multilingual rather than bilingual if the following conditions applied. The language of schooling was French, not English. If they attended heritage school, language school on Saturdays, if applicable. This didn't apply, of course, to the whole sample. If any of the following home language models were used, mixed, one parent, one language, or minority language at home, there was no difference, but not the majority language at home. If the parents spoke a minority language with each other, not necessarily only to the child, but with each other, and if the child had some reading or writing skills in the minority language. And then the other factors, 6, 7, 8, and 9, did not have any significant association, so they're listed there. Okay, I ran a second logistic regression model to investigate the difference between active versus passive bilingual or multilingual outcomes. And here there were only 3 significant associations. So children were more likely to be active bilinguals or multilinguals if they attended heritage language school, if somehow their parents had made them speak a minority language with their siblings, which is something very difficult. And if, again, I think their parents had somehow made them acquire some literacy, some reading and writing skills in a minority language, which is, again, not an easy thing. And the other factors were not significant. Donc, maintenant, pour la discussion, on voit que pour la plupart des parents ont tendance à privilégier la langue minoritaire, tandis que la plupart des enfants ont tendance à utiliser la langue majoritaire. Et c'est un phénomène commun dans un milieu minoritaire. Et on voit vraiment la nécessité d'une PLF forte, politique linguistique familiale forte, pour éviter le basculement linguistique ou la perte de la langue minoritaire. Le choix de la langue de scolarisation est vraiment important. On voit que le français comme langue d'instruction peut être associé pas seulement avec le bilinguisme, mais aussi avec le multilinguisme. Literacy was also important in a minority language because it also increases the probability of attaining active bilingualism or multilingualism. And finally, the language of communication between parents is also important because typically in the literature, when we talk about the different family language use models, the focus is on what the parent speaks to the child. But people discuss more rarely the language of communication between parents, and it's really important to highlight that because this language of communication between the parents is an important modeling opportunity and additional input. So to end this study, I want to give you a brief qualitative quote from one of the participants who said, in Ontario, you have to try really hard not to learn English. So this really nicely sums it up. It says that a strong family language policy in combination with minority language education can help a child become at least bilingual, if not multilingual. Okay, so beyond the mixed methods study, I mentioned already that there were also qualitative interviews that I haven't had a chance yet to analyze, but so that analysis is pending. But in addition to that project, I have another project that I'd like to share some results with you. And that project deals with how are bilingual and multilingual children profiled by educational institutions. Are the complexities of bilingualism and multilingualism reflected by elementary school registration forms? Here is the third project, the language background profiling of incoming students at public elementary schools. By the way, in case you're interested in more details, all the papers that I mentioned here are on my website. So you will have the links if you're interested in reading more about any of them. But now focusing more on the language background profiling at elementary schools, it's done by the basic registration forms that parents fill out when children start going to school. And it's done at the local level, so school boards typically design those forms, or occasionally individual schools also design them. But then the data also gets treated at the provincial level because data from these schools and school boards gets put into provincial databases. What is the purpose of this language background profiling? Essentially, schools, school boards, and provinces want to get to know the language background of their students. It's used for different publicity efforts. So for official documents, sometimes for brochures, for websites, schools and school boards like to say what the linguistic richness or the linguistic background of their student population is. And it's, of course, probably used for provincial reports and curricular purposes. And so these statistics at the provincial level are important. And it can also be used for identification of English language learners, or ELLs, in some cases, not necessarily. So why is it of interest? I am interested in it because I think it's important. It hasn't been studied previously, and in my estimation, it touches the life of millions of children. If we think about the 12-year cycle of a student through the educational system, about 5 million children go through this profiling. And so it has practical implications in terms of language support and understanding of what these students are and who they are and what they speak. But it also shows interesting indications of our understanding of issues related to our societal, I should say, understanding of issues related to bilingualism and multilingualism, and ultimately is related to social inclusion. So in my publications, I discuss this in much more detail and with many more nuances, but here I will give you a very brief description of the notion of the native speaker and some of the challenges that it seems to face in our globalized 21st century world where we know now that many more children around the world are bilingual or multilingual and not monolingual. And so in our context here, a child who is adopted internationally may become a native speaker of the new language. An immigrant child may transition to a new language through schooling and social exposure and again become a native speaker of that second language. A child who is born in a bilingual family where the two parents have different first languages and is exposed to regular input in those two languages from birth is deemed to have two first languages. And a child who lives in a minority language context may just become dominant in a majority language. So in all of these cases, we see that there's this notion of the native speaker doesn't always apply to some of these children, or this notion of a single first language doesn't always apply. So I developed this theoretical approach to language background profiling, and I talk about chronological nativist orientations to language background profiling. So the chronological nativist orientation to language background profiling has these traditional monolingually centered assumptions of a homogeneous society of native speakers. And under this approach to language background profiling, the most normal and natural question to ask would be, what is your first language? What is your native language, or what is your mother tongue? However, there is another approach that we could envision, and that's the synchronic functional orientation. Its assumptions are more bi- and multilingually centered, more heterogeneous, more sociolinguistically relevant. This approach foregrounds an individual's current language abilities and potential to use multiple languages, and I think it's thus more compatible with the well-known notion of plurilingualism. So under this approach, more pertinent questions would be, what languages do you speak and in what context? What languages do you speak best? What languages do you use most frequently? And not necessarily what's your first language. And there is, of course, what I call a mixed approach or a mixed orientation that is a combination of the chronological nativist and the synchronic functional orientation. And this one is, again, compatible with plurilingualism. Donc, on a collecté des données, on a collecté des formulaires d'inscription dans 3 provinces, en Ontario, en Alberta et en Colombie-Britannique. So we collected a total of 96 samples of registration forms. Toutes les questions ont été extraites des formulaires. Les données ont été codées et analysées en termes du nombre et type de questions, des combinaisons de questions et le contenu. And so, after extracting all of these different questions, I place them in different general categories. So here I'm sharing with you 5 different categories. The category of first language, home language, primary language at home, language spoken most often or most fluently, and other languages. And as you see, there are different formulations of the questions used by the different forms. So for first language, we have first language spoken, my child's first language learned is, birth language, and so on and so forth. So we see already a lot of variety in these questions used on the forums. And again, no detailed data, no time to share detailed data with you, but a quick summary of the results. It was very surprising for me to find out that fewer than 2% of the forms allow more than 1 slot for the first language. So essentially, simultaneous bilingualism was not recognized on these forms, which is really a surprising fact in Canada, which is a country with 2 official languages. And we do know that there are families where children are bilingual from birth, right? But I have to say that when the data for Ontario was collected, since the data in Ontario was collected, things have changed. Actually, the forms in Ontario have started changing, and now we see forms where they allow up to 3 slots for a first language. And I don't claim any association between my research and this change. I think it's purely coincidental, but I'm really happy to see it. Okay, so again, summarizing results, what was very interesting also to see was that the number of questions per form differed from one school board to another significantly. The distinct formulations differed a lot. The type and category of questions differed. The combination patterns of questions differed. And of course, there were some inconsistencies, ambiguities, and contradictions within and between forms. So in other words, there's plenty and plenty of opportunities to improve profiling at the school board and the province levels. I want to show you a quick graphic representation of the different perspectives by the 3 provinces. We see that in Ontario, the single most frequently asked question is the question about the first language. So we could call that a chronological nativist orientation. However, in British Columbia, we see that the single most frequently asked question is the question about the home language, not about the first language. And in Alberta, the most frequently asked question is the question about the primary language at home. So we might say that these are more synchronic functional orientations, perhaps a little more plurilingual. Again, there's more nuanced discussion to this slide than I can offer you today, and I discussed that in more detail in the publications. I'm oversimplifying it here, but we don't know why exactly, but we do see this different perspective in the 3 different provinces that were studied. And so in my papers, I offer some recommendations for improved profiling. For sure, allow explicitly for parents to list more than one native or more than one first language for their child. Adopt a mixed or plurilingual approach to language background profiling. So not focus only on the first language and not necessarily focus only on the home language, but maybe have a combination of well-worded questions. And I think standardization across school boards and schools is needed, because what we see currently in provinces is multiple different forms used by multiple different boards and schools, all asking slightly different questions. But all of this information is going to unified provincial databases. So the question of how these differently phrased and worded and different number of questions on the different forms fits into the slots of the provincial database raises questions about reliability and validity of the data. So I think I don't want to talk too much because I know there's a roundtable after this that some of you may want to go to. And so for a general conclusion, I mostly focused on family language policy, as you know by now, one of my key interests. We see that that FLP is an emerging domain looking at minority language maintenance within the family. We saw also that educational systems interact with family language policy, and it's possible for the educational system to work in concert with family language policy and to support minority languages. We also saw that language background profiling is an additional piece of the puzzle. It reflects societal views of bilingualism and multilingualism, and it has practical implications on our understanding of children's potentially very complex linguistic repertoires and the way we can support them. Merci beaucoup. Pleasure. Go ahead. No, I was just a parent who experienced this. I had a bilingual child upon registration at school, and I wrote English and Bulgarian, even though there was only one slot on the form. And then the form came back to me, and they had written only Bulgarian. And then I came back to the school and said, no, no, English and Bulgarian. And I didn't talk to anyone about this, but this was, you know, how they, you register, then they send the form back to you for any corrections. You send the correction, and then you don't know if they've corrected it, but then the next year the form comes again, and I kept seeing that they identify her as a Bulgarian speaker. But as you saw, she's really an English dominant speaker, so if anything, probably she should be identified as an English speaker, but that's not accurate because she does have Bulgarian. And so it arose from this personal experience, which which subsequently some of the reviewers of the articles for the journals that I wrote wrote back, oh yeah, I had the same experience when I registered my bilingual child at school. So I think it's something that touches lots of people's lives. Yeah, so yeah. So no, so the 96 that we got were not too difficult to get because a lot of the time forms are available online, right? These are just the blank forms that you can download. Sometimes we called schools, sometimes we went into schools and picked up forms. But that's just a small sample of really all the forms that are out there, and we have plans to continue with this project with more data from the 3 provinces, but also expand it to other provinces and have a nationwide analysis. But so it's, in theory, this is public information, right? These forms, everyone should have access to them. They're not always very easy to get. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, I mean it's part of the plan to approach decision makers and talk about this, but it's something that's extremely expensive. I think the changing the Ontario system from just one slot to more than one cost millions of dollars to the province because everything is a computerized database, and so I think these things, I think they will happen, not necessarily because of my research. I think they will eventually happen, but they are lengthy and expensive processes. But yeah, I do plan to get in touch with boards, but I really do want to collect more data first so that I can have more reliable findings with even stronger recommendations. Yeah. Mm. So I don't. So Stats Canada has its own census, so there is rich data in the census with regards to this. In Stats Canada, I discussed this in the papers as well, Stats Canada has a fairly nuanced definition of a mother tongue. It is quite flexible and quite well informed. So yeah, the federal statistics are an entirely different pool of statistics than the provincial ones. Not that I know of, right? I mean, I'm thinking of the census data, right, which is different. But one thing that I have to say is that, for example, Ontario has the EQAO, what is it? What is the EQAO? Assurance Office. So it's an independent agency that does these tests with children in grade 3 and in grade 6 and in grade 9. And they collect their own statistics, which are then available. And those are quite interesting. In fact, I'm working on another study based on that data and looking at language shift and looking how children in grade 3 speak more minority languages and in grade 6 speak a little bit less, and in grade 9 speak even less. So I'm looking at language shift there. So there is data, but again, that's not federal. That's, for example, just for Ontario, what I'm talking about. That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. What did you say? Oui, 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 ouais, 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 c'est ça. Ouais, ouais, ouais. Ouais. On a commencé une petite étude avec ça aussi, donc on a collecté des formulaires francophones aussi. On a vu beaucoup de questions qui sont pareilles, mais il y a aussi des questions à propos de droit linguistique, mais on n'a pas vraiment intégré des données ici. We have a presentation coming up with this. In which this spring. So hopefully, yeah, that will be integrated. But yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, this was English-speaking words. Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. But you'd be surprised how parallel the forms are in French because it's still done within the same provincial system. So a lot of the time it's mirroring the English, except the a lot. I think I don't want to say all forms that I've seen for Francophone schools have the language rights question, but I'm sure that almost all of them do, right? But yeah, I mean, I would say that for those schools, there's even a stronger case for more nuanced questionnaires, right? Because those are minority populations by definition. No, no, no. Yeah. So that's a very good question. I do not know. It's more difficult. So private schools are not centralized and not even less standardized in that sense. So it's even more difficult to access this data. So I don't have any data from private schools in Ontario for sure. In Alberta, the situation is a little bit different because the government subsidizes private schools. In Ontario, it doesn't, but in Alberta, it does. So I think there are charter schools and private schools that receive public support in Alberta. And so I think in some cases, I'd have to go back to the data and see. But in some cases, it's possible that some private school forms are included. Or perhaps it was just charter schools, but I'd have to, I don't want to answer this because I don't want to give you the wrong information, but I can verify that, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, yes. Did that get recorded? I don't think she had her mic on. My French is very recent. So when Sophie was born, I probably started learning French around the time Sophie was born. So Sophie was not exposed to any French until she started school, and she went to French immersion. So she's now trilingual. She does have French, but not at the time when these data were. Yes. Complementary. Oui, c'est ça. C'est ça. C'est ça. Oui. Non, 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 non. Pendant oui, pendant during the first 4 years, she was not exposed to French, but then when she was 5, she was exposed to French when she was 4. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Ouais. Ouais. Ouais, ouais, ouais. Ouais. Mhm. Mhm. Ouais, ouais, ouais. C'est une question difficile. Donc, je n'ai pas vraiment un réponse pour toi. Mais euh, ce que je sais est qu'il y a beaucoup de variations dans le développement de langue, monolingue et bilingue aussi. Donc, oui, c'est possible. Et la question de transfert linguistique, c'est vraiment une possibilité qui est discutée toujours. Donc, oui, ouais, 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 ouais. Ouais. Ouais, ouais, ouais. Mais oui, I think it's so like for the specific grammatical structures that I mentioned here, they all exist in English. They all exist in Bulgarian. They're kind of universal structures, right? So yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, transferred them from English? Possible? Yeah, yeah, very possible. Yeah. So that's very possible. It's not really possible to tap into this because she had them in the input in Bulgarian because I never stopped speaking in Bulgarian to her. I probably don't use a lot of relative clauses in my oral production, but we kept reading books to her in Bulgarian as well, so she would hear them there. So whether they came from the input and they were passive and they were just never activated for production, or whether they transferred from English, or maybe both. Yeah, ouais, c'est ça. Ouais, 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 ouais. Mais vraiment une belle question. Yeah. No, she had never. Okay, so she had never seen the film in Bulgarian. She had seen the movie in English, and she saw the musical live in English. Um, but so because this was a short talk, normally when I talk about this study, I also talk about parental discourse strategies. So the strategies where the child will speak in the minority language, and the parent will repeat what the child says. The child will choose the majority language, and then the parent will repeat it in the minority language, or pretend that the parent didn't understand, or ask the child to translate, or there's a list of strategies, and so I used a lot the repetition strategy. So when she was, say, struggling to say something in Bulgarian, I would be talking after her, basically, like dubbing her in Bulgarian. Or if she's speaking in English, I would be saying, yeah, I understand you, but continue speaking in Bulgarian. And in fact, my other daughter a few weeks ago told me she was annoyed by this. And she told me, again, children being part of their own socialization. So my 5-year-old said to me a few weeks ago, I picked her up from school. She goes to French school, comes out of school, and she switches immediately to English with me. And I continue speaking in Bulgarian. Every word that she says, I repeat it in Bulgarian. And she says, Daddy, life is not about repeating everything I say in English in Bulgarian. Right? So, Simo, to answer your question, this is what I was doing with the Lion King. Right? So, yeah. Other than me supplying her with this, than me annoying her with. I was, yeah, so when I pasted this into the slides, I didn't put in my lines, but my lines were like, yes. And then she wasn't sure about the word musical, and I supplied that. She was saying music because she's thinking of the word English, and I said, musical, because it's the same word in Bulgarian. So, yeah, these really intimate linguistic interactions, I assume are helpful.
the L1 is Bulgarian.
Mm-hmm.
The other L1 is English, but there's a French,
Mm-hmm.
and the French among themselves.
Mm-hmm.
What effect does that actually have?
So I had families like this in the questionnaire study. Unfortunately, one would think that 170 participants is enough, but it really is very, very little. And so questions like these couldn't be teased apart in terms of any kind of meaningful, significant patterns. I mean, I don't know. My answer would be the language spoken. Well, we did see, however, that the language spoken between the parents has a significant association with the two variables that I looked at. So it is it is really a very important variable. So I would assume that if the parents speak to each other in French, that influences, that strengthens the child's French, regardless of what the other languages are. Mm-hmm. It's a model because socialization, modeling, additional input are important. No, no. So her Bulgarian stabilized, and so of course she continued to be English dominant, but it never passivized again. And so I hypothesize, I speculate a little bit in the paper, in one of the papers that I wrote, saying that perhaps there is a vulnerable period at that really young age, and once that period, kind of the opposite of the critical period hypothesis, if you're familiar with it, right? So if you pass this, if you manage to stabilize it early on in life, it will be a little less likely to get passivized again, right? So, I mean, we are lucky we have had frequent trips back to Bulgaria, but it has never happened before that within that time frame of a year, she would stop speaking entirely in Bulgarian. Yeah, the social aspect, for sure. In Ottawa? Yes. Mm-hmm. They have now dropped out, but but yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So at that point, she didn't go. She went for a few years when she became school age, so maybe 3 years or 4. Mm. So the immersion school didn't affect her Bulgarian in any visible, anecdotal way, of course. I did not continue with the study. She currently, that's why language background profiling is very interesting, because right now her profile is English is her strongest language, probably in all respects. Bulgarian is her second strongest language for speaking, but so I think her Bulgarian is stronger than her French in speaking, but in terms of literacy, she can read Harry Potter in French, whereas she reads 2 pages of Harry Potter in Bulgarian, she gets tired, right? So in terms of writing and speaking, her Bulgarian is way weaker, but in terms of in terms of writing and reading, her Bulgarian is weaker, but in terms of speaking, and it's stronger than her French. Yeah. So again, the complex, multilingual, plurilingual individual that is not equal in all languages. Ouais. Ouais. Ah, c'est bien. Ouais. 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 Oui, oui, oui. Oui, donc c'est ça. Ça, c'est pourquoi on a dit que the minority language at home model is Possibly, my data did not support that. I assume I didn't have enough data, but if you look at the literature, the minority language at home model gets higher ratings than one person, one language model, right? Because with the one person, one language model, you give an outlet to the majority language, which you really don't need because it's a majority language, it's out there. At home, you really, if you can, you should support the minority language. So I think maybe that's it. And of course, socialization aspects. Ouais, 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 ouais. Merci. Thank you for the nice questions.